Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. All praises are Allah's, Lord of the worlds. And may His peace and blessings be upon our Master, the Holy Prophet Muhammad, and His pure Immaculate Ahlul Bayt. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala. 2 nights ago, I spoke about a certain book which has been translated into English concerning a certain personality, Rajab Ali Khayyat, and I was trying to demonstrate why such books are detrimental, especially to the youth today, and how they're displaying a false image of Irfan, this pseudo Irfan picture of Islam. And we discussed one of the 2 problems it had, both in relation to fiqhi matters and doctrinal matters. The reason I chose that book was because it was translated into English. And I was told, and I've been informed that many people have been attracted to Islam because of this book. When people start getting attracted to Islam for the wrong reasons, the red alert goes on. Because after they become attracted, they'll go astray one time or another. One has to be attracted for the right reasons. Anyway, that book was translated to English. Tonight I thought I'll discuss one other book which has also been translated into English. I mean, there are tens of books, but they're still in Farsi. They haven't been translated into English yet. There's one book where the Arif claims to have assassinated President Kennedy. It wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald or anyone. It was him. See, rubbish like that. And it's a long story. I'll discuss it maybe at the end. But anyway, that's still, alhamdulillah, in Farsi. It hasn't been translated yet. But this book, this next book, has been translated into English. The book is called The Spirit Immaterial, Ruh Mujarrad. The author is Allame Muhammad Hussein Husseini Tehrani, Rahmatullah alayhi. He's passed away. He's written so many good books on aqaid, on philosophy, on fiqh. Towards the end of his life, he was a marja too. This was his last book. And it caused so much trouble in Qom, in Mashhad. And it was a pity. If he hadn't, published this last work of his, he would have been looked at in a different way. Anyway, the personality who's discussed in this book is Sayyid Hashim Haddad, who wasn't a scholar. He was a sincere man. He was literate, but he wasn't a Rouhani, a scholar. Okay. Sayyid Hashim Haddad. So that's the personality we'll be discussing in this book. However, this book, the problems associated with this book isn't as bad as the book I discussed 2 days ago. The major problem with this book is how he's grossly exaggerated the status of a human being. And as I read this, things will become more and more evident to you. There are 1 or 2 other faults too, but the major fault with this book is how he's exaggerated the personality of Sayyid Hashim Haddad. Okay, we'll go through them one by one, inshallah. I'm sorry to bother you with reading extracts from this book, but some people are interested and some people are not. But this is the last one. I won't discuss other books. Unless they get translated into English. Next time I'll discuss them. Yes. Okay. The book begins with the following. O absolute light. So the author is Allama Tehrani. The Arif, the personality is Sayyid Hashim Haddad. I have no problem with the Arif. I have a problem with how the authors disclose this image of Islam. O absolute light. O immaterial spirit. O Haddad. You were ever an ocean that generously opened its wealth, abundance and fullness for the seekers of the truth and the wayfarers of the paths of peace. Life in God and gnosis were the bulging waves of this deep and shoreless sea, and love and reason, knowledge and conviction, mystic disclosure and discovery, insight and strength were the products of its abundant waters that yielded light and knowledge, radiance and clarity, vision and understanding, disclosing its reality to the seekers of the truth. There's always a bit of hyperbole in Iranian writing. The Iranians are known for their sense of exaggeration, their poems and everything. So this much is acceptable. It's nothing problematic with it. And then he continues, Allama continues, the personality of this man was so great and rich that words failed to express it, and so vast and expansive as to transcend the bounds of language. This is still acceptable. It's becoming a bit uncomfortable, but still, to say someone is beyond the bounds of language, I suppose it's still what we call poetic hyperbole. He was so profoundly absorbed in the life in God and the divine being that whatever may be written in this regard would be no more than mere words and expressions, for he, Haddad, transcended all definitions and descriptions. He was a man whose heights remained beyond the frontiers of our reach. This is still, I suppose, acceptable. I mean, it's getting more and more uncomfortable. But this is where things get difficult. He, Haddad, is incapable of description. See, La Yusuf. And what can I say about someone who was not only beyond description, was not only La Yusuf, but also beyond apprehension, also La Yudrak. I mean, the author is not leaving any room for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Beyond description, beyond apprehension. Not that he could be apprehended but not described. He's saying it's not a case that he was Yudrak but La Yusuf. No. He was both La Yudrak and La Yusuf. Not only one of them, both of them. That is why, the Allama writes, that is why there's no mention of his name in my writings and nothing of a biographical account. But the book is 500 pages long. But before he had never written about him, because he was La Yudrak and La Yusuf. Even in my book, Mehr Taban, The Shining Moon, written in reminiscence of my revered teacher, Hejrat Allama Tabatabai, where there is an elaborate account of Hejrat Ghazi and accounts of some of his disciples, and the list of their names, there is no mention of Sayyid Hashim at all. Why? For what reason? The reason was that he cannot be written about. He transcends linguistic expression. He was an eagle of such remote heights that however the bird of thought and contemplation soared high to approach him, it found him to be loftier, more ethereal and beyond access. How can one who is himself within the confines of dimension and finitude describe an immaterial spirit, confine it in a mold, go around it and describe its features? What would the youth think on reading such a description? That there's a man who's beyond description, beyond apprehension, words can't explain him. Well, naturally they'll be attracted to him. These descriptions are specific to Allah. When we say Allahu Akbar, Allah is greater, we mean Allah is greater than whatever you ascribe or describe to him. And then here you're saying he was La Yusuf, La Yudrak. It's wrong to portray people like this. It's not the way forward. You're raising people's hopes for the wrong reasons. You're occupying their heart for the wrong reasons. You're even polluting their heart. If people believe this, once the i'tiqad, the belief is executed, you're polluting the heart. Whatever you believe in, you're answerable on the hereafter. Don't pollute your heart with these kind of things. As to his sleep, basically we did not see him sleep any time during the entire month. You see, that sensationalizing these habits. What's wrong with sleeping? What's wrong with eating? What do you mean he didn't sleep for the entire month? The Prophet and the Imams, they slept, they married, and they ate. The true Sharia, though, wants us to control our sleep, control our eating habits, control our sexual appetite. But nowhere do we see that it portrays that we must not eat, not sleep, not marry. That's not the sunnah of the Prophet. That's not the sunnah of the Imams. It's as if they're trying to sensationalize these aspects for the wrong reason. It's not a virtue if you're able not to sleep for 18 days. It's not a virtue if you don't eat for days and days. This is not a virtue. Other civilizations may have them too. It's not a virtue not to marry ever in your life. The virtue is to eat, to sleep, and to marry, but to control these animalistic appetites. Once you are able to control the nafs, the soul, in these areas, then that's true spiritual wayfaring. Only sometimes in the morning, when he felt really tired, he would go for a hot bath to the bathhouse at the turn of the lane, and this removed his weariness. Or he would relax for a while in the mornings and then go to work. That too, a work which was laborious and exhausting. He was an ironmonger. As he not only made horseshoes, but also nailed them on the hooves of the horses. His state of elation and inner fire would not permit him any rest. So, that was one issue I thought it's important to mention this. During those days, the state of Mr. Haddad was such that he was totally oblivious of the natural world. He felt neither hunger, nor sensed the taste of food, nor heard any sound except when he was spoken to loudly, and that too after repeating several times. If one can conceive of an exteriorization continuing on and off for several days and months, its concrete instance would be the existence of Mr. Haddad. He would feel no hunger. He wouldn't even taste the food. This is supposed to be a high level of Irfan, mathalan. But if this was a high Irfani picture, then the Prophets would have had it, the Imams would have had it. They all tasted food. They all said thank you, this food was lovely. Alhamdulillah. They would all hear people. If this was to be something good, then they would have never felt hunger. They would have never sensed the taste of food, and so on and so forth. This is not the way forward. Our friends from Qazamain related this episode. Once we were returning to Qazamain from Karbala with Mr. Haddad in a minibus. On the way, the driver wanted to collect the fare. He asked us how many we were. Mr. Haddad told him 5. No, you are 6, the driver said to him. He counted again and said, we are 5. We all knew that we were 6, but we remained silent so that the matter of Mr. Haddad be disclosed. The driver's assistant said again, you are 6. Mr. Haddad said to him, brother, don't you see? Look. And then pointing at each of the passengers, he counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4, this is 5. Now what do you say? The assistant replied, Sayyid, you haven't counted yourself. You see. The friend said, what is stranger is that even after that, Mr. Haddad did not find himself. Yes. And although the driver's assistant said to him, you haven't counted yourself, you haven't included yourself, he, who was immersed in the world of unity and oblivious of plurality, could not pay attention to the clothes on his body and take into account and include it with the others. You see, he didn't even see himself. Well, first of all, you're not allowed to have economic transactions, with people if you can't, you're not wary of yourself. It's batil, it's invalid. You can't make a transaction with someone when you don't know who you are, where you are. The important thing is that the Imams, you are nothing compared to the Imams. You're not a speck of dust compared to the Prophet. You're higher than me, okay, but you're nothing compared to the Imams. They never displayed such behavior. They were always in contact with themselves. If this was true Irfan, we would have seen it with the Imams. This is pseudo Irfan. This is negative Irfan. This is not the way that Islam wants us to tread upon. And then say he was immersed in the world of unity. That's why. The Imams weren't. The Prophet of Islam wasn't. All prophets were. But they were with the people. In and out with the people. Those who succeed in refining their fitrah, actually, their senses are more and more attentive. They're more sharp. Ayatollah Bahjat, rahmatullah alayhi, he was very sharp. He would never forget any face. There are people who met him more than 20 years ago, and after 20 years seeing him, he would recount everything. Where he came from, what his name was, everything. The more and more you succeed in refining the soul, the more attentive the souls become. You become sharp. You don't lose hunger. You don't lose taste. It's not a case of losing, contact with yourself. The book gives many examples. I just don't want to take your time. Another issue is this. After Begum, another daughter, Fatima, died at the age of 2 years. This is the second of his daughters that had passed away. He would say, Hashim Haddad would say, in quotes, her death occurred at night. We put her to a side in the room so as to bury her the next day. This is a 2-year-old. To some extent, I viewed her as a child. An infant has died, I thought, and it's not so important. The same night, I saw her soul grow from the corner of the room. It's possible. I'm not saying that's not possible. He saw something, a soul growing from the corner of the room to fill the entire house. So now the soul has filled the entire house. I've never heard of this concept of the soul covering the house in the traditions, but this may be possible. Gradually it became bigger and filled the whole of Karbala. You see, this is, what exactly is the purpose of this speech? And just when you thought things can't get worse, and soon it filled the entire world. Yes. What are you trying to say? Sorry. What do you mean the soul filling the entire world? The soul of a 2-year-old? See? That infant was revealing its reality. Though a child, yet look how great I am. But you see, one has to see what the purpose behind this is. I mean, she was just a 2-year-old. If she was ma'soom, okay, maybe, but not an ordinary 2-year-old. Elsewhere in the book, he would say, in quotes, hence, for the sake of showing respect to our newly born infants, it's good to refrain from intercourse for 40 days and the first few months. Just think, the last few months of gestation anyway, intercourse is, limited to some extent. And then after the child, for the first 40 months, and then for the first few months, he's saying it's good to refrain from intercourse. Where has he got this from? There's nowhere in the traditions. And what's so special about the first 3 months? After the first 3 months, is it allowed? What's the difference here? We don't find this kind of behavior in our traditions. The only thing we have in the traditions is, for those who are differentiating, who understand, don't have intercourse in the same room as them. That has a number of negative consequences. But for a newborn child, and then for the first 40 days, we don't have that in the traditions. And then in the first few months, not to have intercourse. Even if the child, the mere fact that the child is in the house, you should refrain from intercourse, according to Hashim Haddad. The Arifs, sometimes they suddenly bring these prescriptions which are outside the Sharia. The criterion is the Sharia. That's where what you have to abide by. Anything else, there's no need. If you act outside the Sharia, you'll be asked about that in the hereafter. Marhum Haddad was very particular concerning the matters of the Sharia and the religious precepts, the ahkam. It was impossible for him to know a precept without acting upon it. So the author says, even in carrying out the mustahabat and refraining from the makruhat. He was himself a luminous lamp of knowledge. And as I said, he wasn't a scholar, but he was literate though. He was himself a luminous lamp of knowledge, but for the sake of reverence for the Sharia and its laws, he practiced taqleed. For the sake of reverence for the Sharia, he practiced taqleed. No. Either you're a mujtahid or you're not. If you're a mujtahid, you can't do taqleed, it's haram. If you're not, you have to do taqleed. You can't say, oh, just for the sake and the reverence of the Sharia, I'll do taqleed. Because no, you're not a mujtahid, that's why you're doing taqleed. Otherwise, if you're a mujtahid, you don't do taqleed. There's no middle grounds here. The Sharia doesn't need any pity from anyone. Then somewhere else he says, this man never sleeps and is always awake in sleep and the waking state. Wakefulness and sleep are one for him. His eyes closed, but his heart is awake. What else do you want? Yeah. Elsewhere, the author says, Hajj Sayyid Hashim, however, dwelt on a different horizon. To be more precise, on a plane where there was no horizon, freed from all conditioning, beyond names and attributes. Completing the fourfold journeys, he attained to the station of perfect humanity, encompassing all the names and attributes of God. That may be possible, but to some degree, we all may have these attributes of Allah and be manifestations of Allah's attributes, but 10%, 20%, 30%. So far, this is acceptable, that he had attained to the station of perfect humanity, encompassing all the names and attributes of God, the Exalted, but here, in the most complete and perfect manner. He's leaving no room for the Imams here. He was 100% manifestations of all Allah's attributes, in the most complete and perfect manner. We believe only the Imams had this. Even the prophets weren't 100% manifestations in all aspects. The 14 Ma'soom were though. I'm just trying to... There are about 40 extracts. I won't have time for all of them, so I'm just trying to pick the... Once he went to Hamadan, said Hashim Haddad, with the author. As we walked among the graves, I was alone with him at the fore, while the rest of our companions followed us at a distance. The master, said Hashim Haddad, said to me, We had heard that Marhum Ansari used to make frequent visits to this graveyard to visit the tomb of Marhum Haj Sheikh Muhammad Bahari. So Hashim Haddad is saying that we had heard that Ansari, who was an Arif, who had passed away, he had heard, Hashim Haddad had heard that Ansari used to come to this graveyard to visit the grave of someone else with the name of Bahari, who was also a famous Arif. Then Hashim Haddad continues, and often he would come from Hamadan on foot, a distance of 2 farsakhs from Bahar. These visits must have been for the sake of drawing spirituality and seeking assistance from the spirit of Bahari. Now it has become known that Marhum Bahari, who had passed a long way before, did not have that kind of station that Marhum Ansari should have sought assistance from his soul. He's saying, now I've come to the graveyard for the first time, I've seen the tomb of Marhum Bahari. Marhum Bahari wasn't truly elevated for Ansari to have come and visited him. Okay, that's not very polite to say that, but the problem is what follows. So now he's telling us now why Ansari actually came to this graveyard. It wasn't to draw spirituality from Bahari, it was something else. Marhum Ansari, in his quest, had been looking for me. And it was the attraction of this aroma, of this hour, in this place, that drew him many, many years before and prompted him to cover that distance. Is that evident, what he's saying here? He went to this graveyard for the first time. Ansari had passed away. Bahari had passed away. He was told that Ansari would come to the grave of Bahari to draw spirituality. Now he's come to the grave of Bahari, he says no, he wasn't very spiritually elevated. Ansari, let's say 20 years ago, would come to this graveyard 20 years ago because my aroma, which is present today in this place, would attract him all those years ago. Look at this rubbish. Not even the imams would even speak like this. Remember 2 nights ago when I spoke about Rajab Ali Khayyat? The start of his spiritual elevation started when he refrained from this encounter with one of his relatives. The start of Haddad's elevation was when one day he had problems with his mother-in-law. And the mother-in-law would keep on swearing at him, shouting and swearing. He controlled his patience, but he was really angry. So he left the house and kept on walking forward. He kept walking and walking. Then he saw himself divide into 2. He saw the spirit come out. And that was the start of his elevation. It's 2 pages long, but I may not have time to explain all it. This is not a virtue in itself if you can see your own spirit. During my medical years on the psychiatric wards, we would have many of these instances where people will see their spirits. Where the soul does separate from the body, it's possible, it does require, it is possible via the Sharia too. But those instances where I saw, where there were, non-Muslims who experienced these feelings, it was all because they were precipitated with these states of anger or agitation or distress. This is not a virtue in itself. The author of the book says, the great and peerless Gnostic of the century, Marhum Ghazi. Marhum Ghazi was the Ustad of Allama Tabatabai, Ayatollah Bahjat and many others. The great and peerless Gnostic of the century, Marhum Ghazi, about whom our teacher Sayyid Haddad would say, in quotes. So Sayyid Hashim Haddad said about Ali Ghazi, there hasn't been from the beginning of Islam to this day a Gnostic with the comprehensiveness of Marhum Ghazi. How does one know that? How can that be substantiated before one? From the beginning of Islam. To make such a judgment, you must be aware of all the Gnostics from the beginning of Islam to today, and then make a judgment. You can't just say he was the best in Irfan from the beginning of Islam to today. That's wrong. That's the ego talking. Now, inshallah, he's, made an exception with the Imams. He didn't include the Imams in this statement. But from Salman Farsi, from the companions, Abu Dhar, Miqdad, Bilal, the companions of the Imams, after the Imams, all those fuqaha, from Sheikh Mufid, Sheikh Tusi, all these people, Sayyid Murtada, for 14 centuries, he was the best. Whenever you see in these Irfani circles, someone tells you that he was the best, or she was the best, that's the ego. That's the first time you have to put a question mark on that person. Don't listen to this talk. It's not necessary. Marhum Ghazi actually, he was a faqih, he was an arif, he was a true mufassir of the Quran, he was a great man, but he wasn't the best from the beginning of Islam. These things are problematic. It's attracting people for the wrong reasons. Then, in the book, it discusses a tradition. It's called the tradition of Unwan, or anyone who has knowledge. If you know the answer, but you want to test them, this is detrimental to your nafs. You're polluting yourself in a very negative way. It's a sign that the ego is predominating over you. Many people are like this. You have to be careful. Don't try to test others to make them slip. If you've done this before, this should be a red alert. You have to try to refrain from this behavior. Anyway, this was one of the 9. The reason I ask this is because Hashim Haddad, with the author, goes to visit a lady, a very pious lady. 2 hours before noontime, we arrived at the house of that illustrious lady, and she received us in the guest's room. Covered with a white chador, that honored lady seemed to be about 80 years at the time. She came into the room and welcomed us. After the usual hospitalities, she inquired concerning the person of Agha Haddad and the whereabouts of his residence. Hazrat Haddad had told me to converse with this illustrious lady of Alawite descent concerning Tawheed, not about other topics relating to fiqh, usul, tafsir, or even about experiences related to the imaginal realm, mukashafat, and spiritual states, and matters relating to the past and the future. Haddad only wanted the author to speak about Tawheed with the lady. Ultimately, his intent, Haddad's intent, was that the meeting time should not be wasted in the usual kind of talk, but be used to determine the degree of her position in Tawheed and practical Irfan. They wanted to see how strong she was in practical Irfan and Tawheed. Accordingly, this nondescript, that's the Allame, opened the discussion on the topic of Tawheed and put her certain questions which she answered, and her replies were quite appropriate and admirable. Just put this in context of the tradition of Unwan Basri. The master signaled, Hashim Haddad signaled to me to frame my questions more precisely. This nondescript extended the discussion to the subject of the quality of the wayfarer's annihilation and dissolution following his annihilation, in the name, and annihilation in the essence, and the very principle of being, and then ultimately considering the reality of the point of unity between the arcs of Ahadiyya and Wahdaniyya. Dear Lord, you See the question she was posed. They knew the answers themselves. They were just testing her. And I asked her concerning the reality of the unity of the station of the universal wilayah of the infallible Imams. May God's blessings be upon them. The unity with the most sacred divine essence, and so on and so forth. At this point, that lady seemed somewhat to falter, and there was an agitation observable in her reply. Previously, there were pages, they were discussing about the tradition on Unwan al-Basri, that you shouldn't test people, make them slip. He just made the poor lady agitated. You've made her falter. This is a contradiction. You can't just keep on asking to test people. Another issue which is problematic in the book is the issue of Ashura and Karbala. There was a man called Hajj Abdul Zahra. During Muharram, there were sessions of mourning. And the author says that this Hajj Abdul Zahra was full of passionate and ardent fervor, like a burning torch that also affected others. One night, when after a prolonged period of weeping and reddening of the eyes, he went into the mosque. Haddad remarked to me, the author, and said Muhammad Hussein, do you see these lamentations and this burning of the heart of Mr. Zahra? That which goes on within me is 100 times more intense, but it manifests itself in some other way. There's no need to speak about oneself and say that my fervor with respect to Imam Hussein is more than that person 100 times over. Throughout the 10 days of mourning, the state of Hazrat Haddad was very upset. His face became red and the eyes glowed with a light. But the marks of grief and sorrow were not visible in him. He was in total ecstasy. He would say, now listen to this, how ignorant are the people in grieving over this loving martyr who sacrificed his life, and in holding ceremonies of mourning and engaging in breastfeeding. How ignorant are the people. Well, first of all, this is backbiting. When there's a majlis, we have a majlis, and you speak up and disclose their faults behind them. This is backbiting. The problem is that breastfeeding, we don't have this in Islam. We agree with that. There are many traditions that we don't have. These are just traditions which countries have. Different places have different manifestations of these traditions. It's like the hijab. We don't have one form of hijab. You go to Indonesia, they have one hijab, one form. You go to Iran, there's another manifestation of hijab. In America, there's another form. But hijab itself is an Islamic principle. But it may be manifested in different ways, and that's okay. Each culture to their own, as long as the Shari'i boundaries are kept. Sorrow for Imam Hussein is important too. But each culture has their own manifestation. If you see some people beating their breasts or other people doing different, it's okay, as long as it's within the Shari'i boundaries. Anyway, the problem with this though was he was calling people ignorant for mourning, for breastfeeding, for holding these ceremonies. Hazrat Haddad would say the people are unaware, and the love of the world has made them so blind and deaf that they would grieve over that day and weep like a mother over her son's death. All the Imams wept for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. They would weep a lot. Were they blind? Na'udhu billah. Look at Ziyarat Ashura, where people who would celebrate this day, they've been reproached, they've been cursed. All the Imams wept. Okay, Hazrat Zainab alayhi salam said, "Ma ra'aytu illa jamila." That was her high status she had reached. But even she mourned on the day of Karbala, on the day of Ashura. Her lamentations would even make the enemy sorrowful sometimes. It was severe. But Irfani-wise, she regarded all these as manifestations of Allah's attributes. But to call people deaf and dumb, to call them ignorant, that's problematic. The message of Hussein has to continue. Now the manifestations differ, it's okay. Don't let the ego predominate within you. Don't think you are anything better. Oh, these people are breastfeeding. No, we don't want to do that. If you don't want to do it, it's okay, but don't criticize these people. That's their manifestation of their sorrow for Imam Hussein. During the 10 days of Ashura, Hazrat Haddad wept a lot, but they were entirely the laments of ecstasy. At times, due to the intensity of ecstasy and joy, his tears flowed so continuously as if it were a spout pouring out the merciful rains of love over his blessed beard. These were just ecstatic. It wasn't out of any grief for the martyr on that day. This may be possible too, but rejecting and negating the grief of the people, that's problematic. Okay, there's much more, but I think I'll stop there. So, I don't have a problem with the personality. It's just that with these books, an image of Islamic Irfan is being portrayed, which can lead to a number of different problems, especially with the youth in America, or in England, or in Europe, or outside Iran. Now these two books I've mentioned, with the Rajab Ali Khayyat and this one, these have been translated into English. In the future there'll be many more. All I ask you is, when you read this book, always ask yourself, is it within the boundaries of the Sharia or not? And be very careful. Don't develop this affinity with it too quickly. Don't act in haste. If you really want to read them, there may be some benefits sometimes. I mean, it has some good points too. But always be careful. وَصَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَى مُحَمَّدٍ وَآلِهِ الطَّاهِرِينَ.